I still remember the first time they laughed at me in the mess hall at Fort Mason. You'd think after serving 12 years overseas, after dragging myself through the deserts of Iraq and the mountains of Afghanistan, a man would at least earn a little respect. But respect doesn't come easy when you're back home wearing a janitor's badge instead of a uniform with stripes. That day, I was just carrying a bucket of cleaning supplies across the cafeteria when I heard the first chuckle. Then another. And before I knew it, the whole table of young soldiers was staring at me like I was the punchline of some cheap joke. "Hey, Sergeant Harris," one of them called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Miss cleaning latrines in Kabul?" His buddies burst out laughing, slapping the table like it was the funniest thing they'd ever heard. I stopped for a second, my knuckles tightening around the mop handle. Every instinct in me wanted to snap back, to remind that kid that the only reason he was sitting there with a full tray of food and a clean uniform was because men like me bled in places he couldn't even pronounce. But I didn't say a word. I just kept walking. That's the thing about being the underdog. You get used to swallowing words that burn your throat like fire. I told myself, let them laugh. They don't know the whole story. They don't know the nights I spent awake, praying the convoy would make it back without another roadside bomb. They don't know what it's like to bury brothers younger than they are now. Still, it stung. No matter how many times I pretended it didn't matter, the echo of their laughter followed me to the corner where I dumped the mop bucket. I kept my head down, but inside I could feel that familiar mix of shame and anger boiling. It wasn't just about me. It was about the message they were sending my 10-year-old daughter, Lily. If she ever found out that her dad was just the butt of some soldier's joke, I couldn't bear that thought. It didn't stop there. Captain Reynolds, the officer in charge of base logistics, treated me like I was invisible most days. And when he did notice me, it was only to remind me of where I stood. "You missed a spot, Harris," he said once, tossing a rag at my chest, like I was some rookie who couldn't handle a broom. "Funny how some men can serve a whole career and end up right back at the bottom. Life's a circle, huh?" He walked away smirking, leaving me holding that rag like it was some kind of scarlet letter. I could hear the whispers too. Other civilians on base, even some of the soldiers who didn't laugh out loud. They still whispered, "Wasn't that the guy who got discharged early? I heard he couldn't handle it after his wife died. Poor bastard. Must have lost his edge." They thought I couldn't hear. But when you've spent years listening for the click of a landmine under the sand, you learn to pick up on whispers just fine. I won't lie. I thought about quitting more times than I can count. Thought about packing it all up, moving somewhere nobody knew me, starting over. But every time that thought crossed my mind, I'd see Lily's smile when she came home from school. I'd hear her say, "Daddy, you're my hero." And I knew I couldn't just walk away, no matter how many people looked down on me. Here's what they didn't know. Deep inside the top drawer of my dresser, hidden under a stack of old letters, was a medal. Not just any medal. A bronze star with a V for valor. I never showed it to anyone. Hell, most of the men laughing at me had never seen one outside of a display case. But that medal reminded me of something I could never say out loud. That once upon a time when it really mattered, I was the one people looked to when everything was falling apart. That secret was the only thing that kept me steady when the insults came. I'd grip that mop handle and remind myself, one day they're going to see who I really am. One day they'll know the man behind this janitor's badge. I didn't know when that day would come. I didn't know how. But I knew this much. I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. I kept my head down after that mess hall incident. But the truth is, those laughs never really leave you. They stick to your ribs like cheap cafeteria chili. Every time I walked down those hallways with a mop or a toolbox, I could feel the eyes on me. Some of those kids were half my age, fresh out of basic, cocky like they owned the place. And me? I was just the guy wiping up their spilled Gatorade. That's how they saw it anyway. But here's the thing. I wasn't done fighting. I just fought differently now. My battles weren't in the desert anymore. They were in classrooms and quiet corners of the base. 3 nights a week after finishing up on janitorial duty, I'd head over to the community college on the edge of town. Old Chevy pickup, barely holding together, thermos of black coffee on the seat beside me, and Lily's school drawings taped to the dash to remind me why I was doing this. I signed up for classes in mechanical engineering basics. Sitting in that classroom surrounded by kids who didn't know a carburetor from a coffee pot, I felt like the odd one out. But I kept my mouth shut, took notes, and studied harder than I ever did back when I was 18. Most nights I'd come home after midnight, sneak past Lily's room, and see her sleeping with the light still on. She'd fall asleep doing her homework sometimes, pencil still in her hand. I'd tuck the blanket around her and whisper, "We're going to be okay, kiddo." Then I'd drag myself to my little desk in the corner and open up another manual. My body screamed for sleep, but my mind kept running. I told myself, if I can just get this certification, maybe I can move up. Maybe I can wear something better than this damn janitor's badge. Of course, the guys on base didn't see any of that. All they saw was a man past his prime, mopping floors. One afternoon, Reynolds caught me wiping down a corridor outside the comms room. He stopped, smirked, and said, "You know, Harris, some men peak in their 20s. Guess you're proof of that." Shame. He didn't even wait for a response. Just strutted off, boots clicking on the tile like a damn metronome of arrogance. I clenched my jaw so hard it hurt. I wanted to yell, to remind him that I'd been in firefights while he was still learning how to shave. But instead, I just kept scrubbing the floor. That's the part nobody understands. Sometimes silence takes more strength than shouting. Then came the night that changed things, at least for me. A storm had knocked out power across half the base. Generators failed, alarms were going haywire, and panic was setting in. You could hear radios crackling with voices barking orders, soldiers running around trying to figure it out. I was supposed to just stay in my lane, mop in hand, but I knew something was wrong when I heard the hum of the backup generator sputtering like it was choking. I'd spent enough nights tearing apart busted engines overseas to recognize that sound. So I dropped the mop, grabbed a wrench from the utility closet, and made my way down to the generator room. Inside it was chaos, sparks flying, two junior techs staring at the control panel like it was written in Greek. "Move," I said, not yelling, just firm. They looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "You don't know what you're doing," one of them shot back. "This is above your pay grade." "Maybe," I said, rolling up my sleeves, "but if you keep pressing those buttons, you're about to blow the whole damn system." They hesitated, but something in my tone must have landed because they stepped aside. My hands moved on instinct, loosening valves, resetting circuits, rerouting pressure the way I'd done 100 times in the field with equipment twice as busted. Within minutes, the sputtering stopped, and the low, steady hum of the generator came back to life. Lights flickered on across the hall. Radios cleared. The whole place exhaled. And me? I just tightened the last bolt, wiped the sweat from my forehead, and stood up. No applause, no pat on the back. The two techs just stared. Then one muttered, "Huh. Lucky guess." They walked out before I could even respond. Lucky guess. That's what they thought. I wanted to laugh, but it wasn't funny. It was infuriating. I just saved the entire base from losing comms during a blackout, and all I got was a dismissive shrug. But as I walked back down that hallway, something inside me felt different. For the first time in a long while, I remembered what it felt like to matter. To be the guy who fixed things when nobody else could. Later that night, Reynolds passed me in the hall. He'd heard about the generator, I'm sure of it. But all he said was, "Don't get used to playing hero, Harris. Stick to your mop." Then he walked away, leaving me standing there with grease on my hands and a fire in my chest. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just let him go, because deep down I knew something he didn't. Sooner or later, the truth has a way of showing itself. And when that day came, when the stakes were higher than a blackout, I'd be ready. Back in my little apartment that night, Lily asked me why I smelled like smoke. I told her I had a long day. She smiled and handed me a crayon drawing she'd made. A picture of me in a uniform, standing tall. Underneath, she'd written, "My dad is the strongest man I know." I looked at that drawing and thought, "Kid, you have no idea. But one day, you will." Big events on a base always bring out the brass. That morning, Fort Mason was buzzing like a hornet's nest because a 3-star general was flying in to watch the annual systems drill. Everything had to run like clockwork, comms online, vehicles fueled, backup power humming. The kind of dog and pony show meant to impress the higher-ups and remind them their tax dollars weren't being wasted. For guys like Reynolds, it was a chance to strut. For guys like me, it was a chance to stay invisible, pushing a mop in the corner. I told myself to keep quiet, keep out of sight. But life has a way of putting you right where you don't want to be. Halfway through the demonstration, just as Reynolds was running his mouth to the general about operational readiness, the damn main generator blew again. First it was a flicker, then alarms started wailing, lights snapping off across the hangar, screens going dead one by one. The whole place plunged into chaos. Soldiers ran in circles, junior officers yelling into radios that weren't working. And in the middle of it all, Reynolds froze like a deer in headlights. I was standing at the back with a bucket, just like always, when one of the younger sergeants shouted, "Power's gone! Comms are down! We can't reach the control tower!" Panic spread faster than wildfire. Everyone looked at Reynolds. He barked out orders that made no sense. Told the tech crew to just reboot it. But anybody who knows machines knows it doesn't work like flipping a light switch. I felt that old itch in my gut, the one I thought I'd buried. The instinct that says if you don't step in now, people get hurt. My hands were sweating, heart pounding, because I knew exactly what was wrong. I'd heard that choke before, same as the night of the blackout, and I knew the fix. But I also knew what it would look like. The janitor barging in to do a job no one trusted him with. Sure enough, when I moved forward, Reynolds cut me off. "Back off, Harris. This is way out of your lane. Stay with your mop." His voice carried and some of the younger soldiers snickered. The general raised an eyebrow but said nothing, watching. Something in me snapped. "With all due respect, sir," I said, keeping my tone level, "if you keep trying to reboot, you're going to fry the whole system. Give me 5 minutes. I can bring it back online." The room went dead quiet. You could hear the alarms echoing through the hangar, the sound of boots stomping outside. Reynolds' face went red as a stop sign. 5 minutes? You think you know more than my engineers? You're a janitor, Harris. Don't embarrass yourself. I don't know what gave me the guts, but I looked him straight in the eye and said, "I've been called worse than a janitor, but right now I'm the only one here who can fix that damn generator." He opened his mouth to chew me out, but the general lifted a hand. "Let him try." Simple as that. 4 words that hit the room like a grenade. Reynolds sputtered, but he wasn't about to argue with a 3-star. So I grabbed a toolbox, pushed past the 2 clueless techs, and got to work. My hands knew exactly where to go. Valves, fuses, pressure gauges, like muscle memory from years in the field. I could feel 100 eyes drilling into my back, waiting for me to screw up. But the more they stared, the steadier I got. 5 minutes later, the low hum roared back to life. Lights flickered on. Screens blinked awake. Radios buzzed with clear voices. The whole base seemed to exhale. For a second, nobody spoke. Then the general gave a sharp nod. "Good work." That's it. 2 words. But they hit harder than any metal. Of course, Reynolds wasn't done. He stormed up, practically spitting. "You got lucky, Harris. That's all this was." His voice cracked, though, and everybody heard it. That's when Staff Sergeant Miller stepped forward. He was older, a grizzled guy who'd served with me overseas. I hadn't seen him in years, didn't even know he was stationed here now. He looked around at the crowd, then at Reynolds, and said, "Lucky? Is that what you call it when a man drags 3 wounded soldiers out of an ambush under fire? Is that what you call earning a Bronze Star with valor?" The room went silent again, but this time for a different reason. Heads whipped toward me. Whispers started. Some of those young soldiers who used to laugh at me in the mess hall just stared, mouths hanging open. Reynolds' face drained of color. That's not possible," he muttered. But Miller wasn't done. He looked the general square in the eye. "Sir, I was there. Kandahar, 2011. Harris saved my life and half the squad's. We wouldn't be standing here if it wasn't for him. I wanted the floor to open and swallow me whole. I'd kept that part of my life buried for years. Not because I was ashamed, but because every time I thought about that day, I saw the faces of the ones we didn't bring back. I didn't want to wear my medal like a shield against pity. I just wanted to be Lily's dad, quietly doing my job. But there it was, out in the open. No more hiding." The general studied me for a long moment, then said, "Well, Harris, looks like your mop skills are second to your combat record. We'll be talking." And with that, he walked out, entourage in tow. The soldiers around me didn't laugh this time. Some looked guilty. A few even nodded with respect. And Reynolds? He just stood there, jaw tight, eyes darting like a man cornered. He couldn't spin this one. His words had been stripped bare, exposed for the cheap shots they were. Walking back to my closet-sized office, toolbox still in hand, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Vindication. Not pride exactly, not yet, but a spark. Like maybe the man I used to be wasn't gone after all. Maybe he'd just been waiting for the right moment to stand up again. The fallout came faster than I expected. The next morning, word had already spread across Fort Mason like wildfire. Soldiers who wouldn't even look me in the eye a week ago were suddenly nodding when I passed, some even throwing in a "Good morning, Sergeant," like they'd known me for years. Funny how respect works in the Army. It doesn't trickle in, it floods once someone decides you've earned it. But the real storm hit Reynolds. At formation, the general himself pulled him aside in front of everyone and asked for an explanation. Why his unit had nearly botched the drill. Why a civilian custodian had to save the day while his trained engineers stood around looking helpless. I wasn't there, but I heard from Miller that Reynolds stammered through excuses, face red as a cherry, until finally the general cut him off and said, "Fix your leadership, or I'll fix it for you." That line alone got whispered around base like gospel. Later that afternoon, I was cleaning out the supply closet when Reynolds showed up. He shut the door behind him, jaw tight, eyes like ice. For a second, I thought he might swing on me. Instead, he hissed, "You think you've humiliated me, Harris? Don't get too comfortable. Respect doesn't erase the fact that you're still just a janitor on my base." I should have been scared, but I wasn't. Maybe because I could see it in his eyes. Fear. Not of me, but of losing the authority he thought he owned. I leaned on my mop and said, "You don't have to respect me, Captain, but sooner or later, you're going to have to face the fact that you tried to bury a man who's already been through hell and came back standing. Good luck with that." He stormed out without another word, and I swear it was the first time I felt taller than him, even though he outranked me by miles on paper. That same week, Miller stopped by my place after shift, brought a six-pack, just like old times overseas. We sat on my balcony overlooking the parking lot, talking about the men we lost and the ones we saved. He told me, "You know, Harris, you can't keep hiding behind that mop. You've still got fight left in you, and people are starting to see it." I didn't answer right away. I just took a long sip of beer, staring out at the rusted chain-link fence, because part of me wanted to believe him, but another part was terrified of stepping back into a world that had already taken so much from me. Then something unexpected happened. A week later, Colonel Whitaker, the base commander, called me into his office. Walking in there with my faded uniform shirt and janitor's badge felt surreal, like I'd taken a wrong turn. He was sitting behind his desk, stern but not unkind. "Harris," he said, "I heard what you did during the drill. Men like you don't come around often. We've got an opening for a technical advisor position. Pays better. Benefits. You'd be back in uniform, though, not combat. More like training and systems oversight. Interested?" My throat went dry. It felt like the kind of offer you dream about when you're scrubbing toilets at 2 in the morning. But all I could think about was Lily. Did I want to drag her back into the military world after I'd promised her a quiet life? Did I want to put her through the long hours, the unpredictability, the weight that never quite leaves your shoulders? I told him I'd think about it, and I meant it, because saying yes would mean redefining everything, not just for me, but for her too. Meanwhile, the shift in how people treated me was almost comical. Guys who used to crack jokes at my expense were suddenly asking me for advice on gear maintenance or deployment readiness. One even asked if I could mentor him on leadership. Leadership. From me, the guy they used to laugh at while I pushed a mop bucket. I wanted to tell him to shove it, but instead I said, "Sure, but you're going to have to start by shutting up and listening more than you talk." He laughed awkwardly, but he knew I meant it. And then there was Sarah Thompson. She wasn't military. She worked in base operations as a civilian contractor, daughter of some retired general I never met. but she'd been around long enough to see how I was treated before the drill, and she was one of the few who never joined in. One night after shift, she caught me in the parking lot. "You know," she said, "you've got a hell of a way of proving people wrong. Most folks would have broken by now." I shrugged it off, muttered something about just doing what needed to be done, but she looked me dead in the eye and said, "No, you're not just doing what needs to be done. You're reminding people what integrity looks like. That's rare around here." Her words stuck with me more than I expected. I'd been so used to being invisible that hearing someone recognize my worth without conditions felt strange and comforting. Still, nights weren't easy. I'd lie awake on that lumpy couch, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the choices in front of me. Part of me wanted to stay where I was, safe, predictable, small. Another part knew Miller was right, knew Whitaker was right, that hiding behind a mop wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about fear. Fear of becoming the man I used to be, the man who carried the weight of others' lives in his hands. The biggest surprise, though, came from Lily. One evening, she crawled into my lap with one of her school projects, a paper about my hero, and right there in crayon handwriting, she'd written, "My hero is my dad because he never gives up, even when people don't see him." I felt my chest tighten, and I realized something I'd been ignoring for too long. This wasn't just about me. This was about showing her that you don't let the world define you, that sometimes you get knocked down so hard it feels permanent, but you stand back up anyway, because the people who matter are watching. So when Colonel Whitaker called me again the next week, I didn't hesitate. I said yes. Not because I wanted to prove Reynolds wrong, though that part felt damn good, but because I wanted my daughter to grow up knowing her father didn't quit when life got ugly. Reynolds never congratulated me, never looked me in the eye again, and that was fine by me. Some men change when they're exposed, others just dig deeper into their bitterness. But me, I was done shrinking. I was ready to redefine what the rest of my life would look like. Taking that new role wasn't some magic fix. Life didn't suddenly turn into roses and parades just because I traded a mop for a technical advisor badge. The pay was better, sure, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't have to count every dollar before buying groceries. But what mattered most was something harder to measure. I walked around Fort Mason with my head up, and people looked at me differently. Not because I'd embarrassed Reynolds, not even because of the medal they finally whispered about. It was because they saw I never quit, even when it would have been easier to disappear. The first week on the job, I was assigned to train a group of young recruits on equipment maintenance. Most of them barely out of high school, cocky like I used to be. They came in joking, half listening, the same way they did when I used to mop around them. I could feel the disrespect simmering under the surface. But instead of barking at them, I started with a story. I told them about the time our convoy broke down in Kandahar, middle of nowhere, Taliban radio chatter echoing through the hills, and how a busted alternator stood between us and never making it home. I didn't dress it up, didn't dramatize it. I just laid it out plain. That night, it wasn't about glory. It was about tightening a belt right, with shaky hands in the dark, knowing every second counted. That's the difference between treating this job like a joke and treating it like life or death. The room went quiet, and for the first time, I saw respect in their eyes. Not because of medals, but because they realized the work mattered. That was the moment I knew. This job wasn't about fixing machines anymore. It was about shaping how the next generation carried themselves. Sarah started showing up more often too. She'd bring Lily little snacks after school, or stick around to watch me run drills. One night after I wrapped up training, she told me, "You're different with them. You're harder, but also softer in a way. Like you want to make sure they don't repeat the mistakes you saw." I didn't know what to say, so I just shrugged and said, "Maybe I'm just tired of bearing kids who never learned how to take things seriously." She didn't push, but she slipped her hand in mine, and I realized maybe I didn't have to carry all of it alone anymore. As for Reynolds, he never apologized. Men like him rarely do. He got reassigned a few months later, and rumor was it wasn't a promotion. Word travels fast in the Army, and respect is a currency you can't fake for long. Seeing him pack up his office without looking anyone in the eye was enough of a payoff. I didn't need revenge. Watching him face the weight of his own arrogance was enough. The biggest change, though, came at home. One Saturday morning, Lily pulled out the bronze star I'd kept hidden in my drawer. I must have forgotten to lock it away. She held it in her little hands and said, "Daddy, why don't you wear this?" I froze. All the excuses I'd used. Didn't want pity. Didn't want to live in the past. They all sounded hollow when I saw her eyes, shining. I knelt down and told her, "Because this isn't about me. It's about the men we lost. But if it means something to you, then maybe I'll wear it when it matters." She smiled like she'd just been handed the moon. And in that moment, I realized that medal wasn't just a reminder of pain. It could be a beacon for her. Proof that her dad stood tall when it counted. That night, I pinned it on for the first time in years. Not for me, but for her. And when she looked at me like I was 10 feet tall, I understood something I should have known all along. Sometimes the people we fight hardest to protect are the very ones who remind us who we are. Looking back, the lesson isn't complicated. It's not about medals or titles or proving yourself to people who'll never like you anyway. It's about refusing to let the world shove you into the shadows when you know damn well you've still got something left to give. It's about showing your kids and yourself that dignity isn't tied to rank or paycheck. It's tied to whether or not you quit. So if you ask me what I'd tell those young recruits or my daughter when she's old enough to really understand, it's this. Don't let anyone define your worth. Not the man barking orders, not the crowd laughing in the mess hall, not the whispers behind your back. Stand your ground. Do your job. Keep moving forward. One day, the same people who wrote you off might just end up taking notes. That's not revenge. That's redemption. And that's a hell of a lot sweeter. Life has a way of testing us in the quietest and harshest ways. Sometimes it's not the battles we fought overseas or the long hours we worked, but the way others choose to see us or refuse to see us at all. This story is a reminder that dignity isn't tied to rank, wealth, or what others whisper behind our backs. It lives in the way we keep showing up, even when mocked, overlooked, or pushed into the shadows. As the saying goes, true gold doesn't fear the fire. When you hold on to integrity, when you refuse to quit, the truth eventually comes to light. For anyone who's ever felt dismissed, disrespected, or underestimated, the lesson here is simple but not easy. Don't let the world define your worth. Stand firm in who you are, even when others try to reduce you to a label or a job title. Break the silence of toxic judgments by living in a way that speaks louder than insults. Remember that respect earned through resilience lasts longer than applause gained through arrogance. And sometimes the sweetest victory isn't revenge. It's redemption. It's proving to yourself and those you love that you were stronger than the storm. I'd love to hear what part of this story spoke to you most. Have you faced moments where you had to rise above unfair treatment or prove your worth when no one believed in you? Share your thoughts or your own story in the comments below. If this message touched you, give the video a like to help spread it further, and subscribe so you won't miss more stories that challenge, inspire, and stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Until next time, may you find peace in the middle of the chaos and strength in knowing your story still matters.